Greetings, this is ETV English Special Program. Presenting you with this edition, I am Kirana Baina. Thank you for joining us and do stay with the remainder of the program. Recently, the so-called mainstream media are being called out for the fake news and misrepresentation campaign that they're on, a fact that has been made clear to many Ethiopians and some parts of the international community ever since the outbreak of war in Ethiopia's northern region back in November 2020. Now, although they're being denounced and called out, this campaign still carries on. So in today's program, we're going to be looking at the underlying reason behind this kind of reporting and what could possibly be done to mitigate it. Joining me to have this discussion is Ethiopian American journalist, widely renowned as being the founder of the #NoMore movement, somebody who's increasingly becoming a face of debunking the kind of reporting that's being carried out by the so-called mainstream media. Joining me all the way from Los Angeles via Zoom is Hermela Aregawi. Hermela, thank you very much for giving us the time.
Kiran, thanks for having me.
All right. So as you know, mass media is often thought of as the source of truth and freedom for most. But recently, we're seeing a different view, especially regarding the mainstream or Western media. And there have been different instances. For instance, I want to raise an article that Mohammed Hirichi wrote. He's an associate professor of French and Arab in Colorado University. And he wrote about the media misrepresentation of the Middle East. And as you know, the Middle Easterns have been given this kind of stereotypical figure in the United States, especially since 9/11 and the American invasion of Iraq. So now we're seeing it happen to our country. And so my question to you, since you've been part of the mainstream media for long and you have that experience, is what's the underlying intention behind the kind of reporting that they do?
I like that you, Kiran, refer to the mainstream media as the so-called mainstream media. I think it's really important for us to change the way we speak. Why is the mainstream media, which perpetuates a lot of lies, called the mainstream narrative, right? We're going to live in a world where there are lies. That's not going to ever go away. But the idea that they're coming from these sources that we call the mainstream, which then means the other ones are the alternative to the truth, is I think something that we need to continue to push back on. And so much of what we're doing with No More is pushing back against that. And I'm one of the co-founders. So there's a lot of people that do the work on this. And I'm so glad you brought up the issue of the Middle East and the way the Middle East has been misrepresented in so many ways. We saw the disinformation that led to the invasion of Iraq in 2003. And what makes No More so powerful is it saw those parallels in so many other different countries. We realized we were not the first. And if we didn't do something about this formula of disinformation, division, and war, that it would continue. So we saw how other parts of the world were facing disinformation through these so-called mainstream media outlets, which would weave this really twisted narrative, sprinkling the truth with lies, often just resulting in a completely different context than the reality, and disinforming the public, which would otherwise push for the right thing to do on any particular foreign policy issue. But because they're disinformed, much like they have been on the case of Ethiopia, perpetuating the TPLF propaganda, they're pushing for solutions that just are not actually fit for the problem. And I have to just assume that most Americans are good people that don't have the time to really dig into all of these issues, even in Congress. I think many politicians just don't have the time to dig deeper. They do rely on the CNNs and the Reuters and the New York Times, and they rely on their colleagues to tell them what to think about Ethiopia. I mean, we've been on calls with Congress people who had sponsored bills and they forgot that they had sponsored a bill. So there's a lot of things moving through their desks, and Ethiopia is just, they're going to just take the shorthand on most things. And their sources are these so-called mainstream media outlets. So I think what's really important for No More to continue to move forward is bring other people along with us. Do not, move only among Ethiopians or Eritreans. We have to find our allies in different parts of the world, and that example of the Middle East is a really great one. One of my favorite journalists that I really respect, Elijah McClain, is from the Middle East. He's a veteran war journalist. And I spoke with him about this time last year. And he said the Ethiopia issue is the Iraqi issue. The Iraqi issue is the Syria issue. It's the same thing over and over again. Some of the details might be different, but the way they go about manufacturing consent to invade our countries or to arm rebels within the countries and cause instability looks very much like what Ethiopians and Eritreans are experiencing now.
Okay, so if we're going to say that members of Congress or other politicians kind of get their information from these sources, then whose interests are they looking to consolidate with these kinds of reporting?
So I think they're perpetuating the interest of an elite few that are running the U.S. and other Western countries that are doing it in the name of U.S. foreign policy, but really it's a elite, greedy few in the large scheme of things. I think they mirror to me the way that the TPLF works. There's elements of people in U.S. foreign policy and government and corporations that operate much like the TPLF do, in the sense that they use their money to buy control. So the U.S. policy is essentially to have control in as many different places as possible. And the Horn of Africa is a very strategic place. Over $1 trillion in trade goes through that area. It connects some key parts of the world. And so I think it's about control.
I believe it was on Breakthrough News that I heard you say that you believed the reporting in the beginning. I mean, first you saw it, I think this is the sequence, correct me if I'm wrong. You saw it on activist posts such as Alula Solomon about an Aksu massacre, and then you saw it on CNN and thought, if CNN is reporting on it, then I quote you, they must have done the work. Now that's how we perceive their reporting in many instances. But ever since the outbreak of war and all the events that followed after and the reporting that they've done, I think it's kind of clear that they're out to slam the Ethiopian government, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. I mean, they used the Nobel Peace Prize winner turned dictator piece. They've played that trumpet quite many times. And they dispense this misinformation as if they're on some kind of campaign alongside the TPLF. So my question here is basically, I mean, why are they aligning with TPLF or rebels as they place them, or it's a designated terrorist group?
I mean, it's a very good question. I mean, the comfort level continues to stun me. I mean, they are way too comfortable considering how much the resistance there is on the narrative. I think again, it comes down to control. So the US wants control in the Horn of Africa, and the TPLF gave it to them for a very long time. As long as they were able to embezzle the money, the development money made for Ethiopia, and live the way that they were able to live and have that level of dominance and just certainty that they could make the realities, whatever they decided they were, with their money and their power and their guns. They didn't care what the US did. The US essentially controlled the security apparatus of Ethiopia and the larger Horn of Africa, including Somalia. Now, Eritrea has always been a problem for the US because Eritrea controls its own security apparatus. So the US African Command, AFRICOM, is not in Eritrea. Eritrea controls its own security. And so that goes against the mission of control of the Horn of Africa for the US. So I think that's what was good about TPLF for the US, and I think that's what they're continuing to fight for. And the Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed is not that guy. I mean, he's also still very friendly to the US. So it's not an issue of, is he friendly enough? Is he willing to work with them? I think that he has always been, and he continues to show openness. But what we're learning, and I imagine that he's seeing, is this is not an option between work, be more flexible with the US, but you still have sovereignty, the right to decide what is good for your country, for your people, to develop, to grow, to give opportunities to people. It's not that choice is not there if you choose to work with the US in the way that they want you to. And we're finding out too. I mean, it's a shocking revelation when you realize, wow, this is just about pure dominance in this day and age. They're not negotiating. What's happening in South Africa right now. I don't have a lot of details on it, but we can all guess what's happening. The TPLF makes its own the things that it wants public on social media and in its letters, and it's all just delusional asks. I mean, you have this entity that was in power for 27 years. It should have been enough. You should be able to bow out after 27 years. Most regimes don't get that much. And instead of peacefully transitioning, they chose to retreat back to Tigray and pretend like they were running their own country, have their own elections separate of the rest of the country at a time where there was a pandemic raging around the world. And then, as if those acts were not already acts of war, they actually attacked the National Army base in Tigray. So the fact that that group even has a seat at the table shows you it's a crazy world. It's a crazy world that we live in. But I think because of the Ethiopian National Defense Forces strength on the military front, I do think that the Ethiopian government is in a good position, and it has the Ethiopian people behind it. What I continue to say about TPLF is this is not an issue of how upset they're making this government of Ethiopia. Governments come and go. The prime minister will have his time, but the people are not going away. They're not going to forget what you
Speaking
did
of
in
the
the 20.
people, sorry to cut in there. I
No,
mean,
please go
it's
ahead.
been in power for 27 years, like you said, and throughout that time, for different reportings, but we haven't really actually heard of the atrocities that it was committing, even while it was in power. I mean, back when Donald Trump was president, we rolled our eyes when he said fake news, but it gets you thinking. I'm not saying I agree with everything Trump says, but it gets you thinking for 27 years since they've been able to consolidate their power, the United States and other superpowers, can we really believe all those reportings that have been carried out throughout the 27-year reign of the TPLF? Does it kind of, make it false? It just negates everything that they've said so far.
It definitely makes it questionable. I think it's a very good question. I mean, I look back at the times when I heard, pre 2018, the fastest growing GDP in the country, I'm feeling like, oh, Ethiopia's, it's doing well. Like when I came here in 1994, we were known for the famine, right, in the 80s. And so it was almost, it was one of those things, oh, Ethiopia, ooh, okay, like it wasn't really known for anything good back then. So yeah, I have to go back and question that, because when I go back to the country now, or when I have a few times in the last 3 or 4 years, it does not look like a country with with the kind of GDP growth rate that they reported then, at least not outside of a few major cities. So yes, you have to assume, and I mean, this again, it's another good question. If the reporting that we're getting now that they're out of power, the TPLF is out of power, is so skewed, you have to believe the pre-2018 reporting is also skewed. So it's going to be the opposite, more favorable to Ethiopia or to that current Ethiopian government, because they want to make that government look good. If we're talking about economic development and metrics, even with this war going, there's a lot of incredible developmental actions that are being taken on the ground, from agriculture to jobs for women to education. The fact that we even have that library, the way that it's set up, that kids are in there reading, that we have parks. I mean, these things are increasing the quality of life. And when you're measuring the economy and how healthy it is, these things should be a part of that, not the gross domestic product. I mean, how are they even getting these numbers? What formulas are they using? Are they really looking at how that's impacting the people's lives, or they're just talking about how much comes in, period? And I think it's the first. which does not tell you whether a country is actually economically growing or not.
These mainstream media or so-called mainstream media outlets, they do the reporting in the name of Tigray people are suffering, or they use Tigray genocide on social media, that is. Are they really reporting for the people of Tigray, or are they on this kind of mission to destabilize Ethiopia or disintegrate the country?
It's absolutely the latter. I mean, I don't know how many ways to say it to people from Tigray that are buying into this narrative that the US or these mainstream media outlets or the State Department care about what happens to the people of Tigray. They do not care. The people of Tigray have been dying in this war since November 2020. There is no way that some of these outlets and these officials did not know that this war was going to happen, because there were people in Tigray on the ground, people that have spoken to folks that I've spoken with that were saying, hey, when's the war going to start? Or when are we going to do it? They knew there was going to be some sort of lightning strike military action that's happening. So if some ordinary people in Tigray knew that was going to happen pre-November, and you have all these institutions that were just ready to go to do this sort of advocacy, then absolutely the US knew it. And now this is anecdotal, but if you look at Getachew Reda's Twitter account, it was started in September 2020. If you look at a lot of Tigray advocacy organizations, they were started about that date. So if the US or any of these entities cared about what happened to Tigray, they could have prevented it. With the US's power, they could have prevented that war even happening. And if it couldn't do that, as soon as the TPLF attacked that command, and that the Trump administration was actually getting it right for the first couple of months, and then it flipped when the Biden administration came in. But at least if they could say, hey, this is simply a rebel group that's not empowered, that attacked a National Army defense base, we condemn this. If that was all that they did, and actually, took the time to write these stories and make sure they cross-referenced it. I mean, these stories were done overnight. You cannot do a story of mass casualty just overnight without, asking for evidence, without cross-referencing, without having people, reliable people on the ground, journalists on the ground, not just from abroad in Nairobi or in Addis even, journalists who don't speak Amharic, who don't speak Tigrinya, who have zero cultural context, who are coming in with their own political leanings and claiming to care about the people of Tigray. I mean, we have yet to see how much loss has happened in Tigray because of this war. But I'm telling you, or I believe, the United States does know the level of casualty. And that is why they are fighting for this like it is their own issue, because they know they are complicit in the amount of damage that has been done because of this war. And they were hoping that the TPLF would win, just like the TPLF was hoping that it would win and take over Addis and Ethiopia, and then get in the way of the investigations and what they look like. They always say the winner can write the story. In TPLF's case, they've done it before, and they were hoping to do it again. So I think the US is also fighting for itself, because it knows that it has played a part in how bad this conflict has gotten.
All right. So now moving on to the rallies that are condemning this kind of fake news and as well as foreign intervention. I mean, what message are they conveying to these media outlets? And first of all, like, how are the mainstream media depicting it? How are they receiving it?
So I'll say this, I see a little bit of a change in mainstream media. They're not jumping the gun and making these major accusations like they were before. And I'll give you a few examples. CNN's Nima El-Bagir, no longer here, no longer there reporting on Ethiopia, right? Huge win for Ethiopians. She's moved on to Ukraine and doing the same propaganda on the Ukraine issue. So that's huge for us, because if she was around, she would be cooking up the same type of stories. I'm sure she would have just pulled out her old files, changed up a few things, and then put it out there as a new story. And you see the worst that I've seen reported in terms of, what looks like propaganda is the Associated Press's Cara Anna, who looks like a low-level journalist to me. I mean, they just let her spin whatever tales from somewhere abroad. You don't even know where she is. She doesn't have a very strong online profile. And so what she wrote is witnesses say Eritrean soldiers have done A. And, then you see Tedros Adhanom saying the Ethiopian soldiers tried to burn down whole cities. And we saw that video. I mean, these things you have to cross-reference. Just having something like that out there, no journalist that's actually trying to do a good job would just run with it. So, you see places like Reuters, the worst I've seen Reuters say, they posted the Associated Press article, which a lot of people do. The Associated Press is something that a lot of mainstream media outlet uses because they're a wiring service. But original stories, the worst I've seen Reuters say is this act of war, the latest act of war, is raising concerns about civilian casualties. And that tells me these organizations are thinking about their survival, right? You can only go so far perpetuating a propaganda when you've got millions of people around the world saying, no, no more. We see what you're doing. This isn't true. We've told you over and over again. And so I do see a change. I still think it's up to us to continue to push for it, because if we relax, then they'll go back to fabricating stories. But I don't know. It's gonna shift. I mean, there's already slowly shifting.
So to follow up on that, you said that there's change regarding the reporting that they're doing. But do you think at the end of the day that it will be powerful enough? I'm talking about the rallies. Do you think they'll be powerful enough to put a halt to what they're saying? Are they that effective?
I think it raises the hesitation. It's not going to make these outlets do a 180. That's not what they're there to do. They're still going to try to push for the State Department or the European Union's agenda. But if we weren't there, if the rallies weren't there, and the people were not physically going somewhere to say something, waking up in the morning, we saw the rallies in Addis. I mean, it was the sun wasn't up yet, right? So if people are actually showing up in those mass numbers, as we saw in the drone footage, they have to think twice. There's resistance. The number of people matters. The reason that they've gotten away with so many other stories is they don't see that level of resistance. We actually have a population benefit. Like, we have a huge population, the Horn of Africa. It's a region of 140 million people, and much of that region is united right now. And then there's all of us, in the diaspora. So a lot of countries don't have that kind of population numbers, but I do believe in the people's power to make them hesitate before they weave stories that they do not have the evidence to publish.
All right, so you've raised the diaspora community, and these rallies have actually been going on in Addis Ababa as well as in different cities around the world. Now, looking at the diaspora community, what has it been doing? I mean, I'm well aware of the Twitter campaigns, the rallies again, and trying to make an influence on the governments of the countries that they're in. But apart from that, what is some kind of, solid action that's being taken by the diaspora community?
Yeah, the Twitter campaigns, we do them in our sleep now. It's like it's just something that's going on all the time, right? And then you've got the Twitter Spaces. We had a discussion today about midterms and how to vote. You've got organizations like APAC, who has literally curated a list of people for people to vote based on their stance on Ethiopia. If they're pro-Ethiopia, here's who to vote for in Colorado, in Pennsylvania, in Washington, D.C. That takes a lot of work. And then you've got just a community building element. I was in DC and New York and Seattle in September, and a lot of that is getting in a room with people and saying, hey, we have the same values, we have the same mission. Nice to meet you. What's your story? We need to build our community. Like, those kind of things take time, and they're important. You don't see them on Twitter, or you don't see them on media. That type of community building is really important. There are people that are working on election committees, that are educating people on voting. There's what I do a lot on media, on Hermela TV on YouTube, which is having those conversations. There is trying to build coalitions with other groups like Haitian Americans, progressives, anti-war groups. What else is there? There's different media outlets. You've got, places like Hello Ethiopia that are starting up. You've got people that are starting their own YouTube channels, and I love it. There's room for everybody. Like, the more of us, the better. I'm working on developing Eyes on Africa News. I'm constantly in touch with people on the ground, government officials, regular folks, to try to understand what's happening on the ground, both in Tigray and here. And so a lot of it's education and community building, and then engaging in our civic population. And there's also fundraisers for IDPs that happen from time to time, although I see that has slowed down, but there's always stuff happening in the diaspora. And I look at us right now, and we're looking pretty united, and I'm really impressed with that. And we reflect what it looks like on the ground in Ethiopia. When I saw those rallies, like we are in sync, and that's a good thing.
So you said something about partnerships, creating partnerships with other diaspora communities. And now I'm wondering where we're at on using those platforms. I mean, it could be either with Latin American diaspora communities or Middle Eastern diaspora communities. How is the diaspora community actually using that platform?
That's a very good question. I mean, we have a very good relationship with Haitian Americans, particularly because they're dealing with a potential UN intervention right now. And I have a relationship that I've made through this conflict, that because of this conflict and what they saw I was saying, and we were able to get on the phone and meet each other in person. So the Haitian American community is a really strong one. There's individual connections from folks in the Middle East, like I mentioned, Elijah McClain, who's a veteran Middle East war journalist, the folks at Breakthrough News, who I have to mention, and Answer Coalition that Eugene Puryear is a part of. Rania Khalek is with Breakthrough News, and that team there is in New York. Met all of them, and they really do a good job of educating us, the Ethiopian Eritreans, on what's going on in Cuba and Venezuela and the parallels there. There's some stories coming out of Mali, so it's a slow building because it has to be organic, and you have to make sure you know each other and that you're on the same page, because there's always people just waiting to hijack the No More movement, or to hijack what we're doing and get in between us. And so, for example, if you look at some of the TPLF activists, if you don't know better, and I remember one of them actually reached out to one of my Haitian journalist friends, and they tried to say, hey, you don't know what's going on. The No More movement's actually a genocide movement, whatever. And she came back to me and she said, I know exactly who these people are, because there are the parallel versions in Haiti. But if it wasn't her, if she didn't have that deep understanding, she might have been alarmed. So you have to make sure you're connecting with people that are deep rooted in the issue, and that will not be influenced and swayed when the TPLF camp comes to them with some reasons as to why we are not who we say we are.
We're seeing a lot of support coming from the United States to the TPLF, and there's a lot of warning the government of Ethiopia with sanctions and etc. So one might wonder, I mean, why is the Biden administration really an ardent supporter of the TPLF, basically?
I think there's a lot of personal relationships that get in the way, from the State Department, from people that used to be in Democratic administrations, the Susan Rices, the Samantha Power, the Obama, which has a lot of influence um, in this Biden administration, and there's people in the State Department who have very personal connections to TPLF leadership or to Tigray. So a lot of it comes down to something really personal. And then the other element is about having a proxy that they can essentially divide Ethiopia through. And the TPLF is the best proxy an imperialist force like the US government's foreign policy could dream of. And so, what's worth noting about politicians is, and the work that we're doing with the midterm elections, let me be clear, this work is important, but it's not going to change things overnight. We're planting the seeds for a different kind of foreign policy on Ethiopia. We are trying to undo the work of not just 27 years, but 50 plus years. I mean, we're trying to undo the work of decades of misguided foreign policy on the part of the US. So yes, we are, trying to make friends, APAC, all of these amazing people that work with them and through other organizations, Ethiopian American Development Council in Colorado, GLEAN, the EACC based in Canada, does their own sort of advocacy and political work, but it's going to take time. It's one person at a time. It's a way of starting the work. We often talk about this as a marathon. who's going to bring the quickest change or the most dramatic and effective change is us, the people of Ethiopia and Eritrea that are both in the country and all over the world. When the US aggression escalates, and it might, we have to keep open the possibility of some sort of sanction measures if the US doesn't get what it wants, which is to have the TPLF leadership as part of the Ethiopian government, which is an insane ask of the Ethiopian people after what they've been through in the last 2 years, but in the last 30 years. And like you said, we haven't really done the work of what has actually happened in those 20 plus years, what the US knew, how much was really suppressed. I mean, I know there was a lot of people that couldn't go back to Ethiopia because of political persecution. The 1 in 5 rule, where the TPLF had one person in every family out of every 5 in a family spying. I mean, what kind of world were Ethiopians living in? I mean, I was living in an American world. Like, I had no idea the level of which until I became an adult and started to see that people had different perspectives, but still not understanding the depth of it. So we're not relying on the State Department to change its policy tomorrow or next year or in 2024. We're not relying on any one politician, not the special envoy for the Horn, to change their minds and hearts and then change everything for Ethiopia tomorrow. We need to rely on ourselves and figure out, if sanctions come tomorrow, how can we, the Ethiopians abroad, the Ethiopians of privilege inside Ethiopia, how can we help mitigate that? How can we help sustain the country? Because if the country has to choose between sovereignty and having some financial loans or not having sanctions from the US, I think what it's going to do is choose sovereignty. It's a basic requirement for a country to even be a country and have a say in its destiny. So once again, I believe in the people. I believe in our ability to grow and learn and help each other, to build our communities. I mean, the amount of collaboration and togetherness that has been created as a result of this devastating war is actually really just uplifting. You know, where would we have been if we've been doing this for years? But there's no sense in saying that. What I will say is, if we continue to work like we are, those of us abroad, to protect Ethiopia from these really just greedy foreign policy measures, if we continue to try to do our part to help the people around us, to help the less fortunate on the ground, if we continue to build our political pull out here in the United States in our respective countries, if we continue to push back against false narratives and create our own media outlets that tell our stories better and better in the language that they can understand across the world, then things will get much better 10 years from now. So this work that's being done on the politician level and resisting the State Department, it's just a necessary part of the work to resist. But ultimately, it's up to us. If we start to be divided over stories that they're telling us tomorrow because they're talking about our ethnicity this time, and now we feel it differently, and then we start looking at the people next to us as enemies, and we start turning against this government. And you can criticize this government, by the way, but you can't say this government has to go. That's just not how sovereignty works. That's not how democracy works. You need to help reform it, and then you need to create other political structures and conversations that are productive. And so that's ultimately whom I hope in, is the people and younger people who have been poisoned by this ethnic politics. And those who are just, getting more educated and motivated and are becoming real experts in advocacy.
How the diaspora community could use this midterm election to make a significant impact.
I think we have to get out there and vote. We have to vote. We have to look at the list that APAC took the time to put out there, and it's on the website, aepact.org, so apact.org. Go look and see if your state is on there. I know several states are on there, and go vote for that person. The work has been done. So go vote, first of all. Go look to see if you know who you need to vote for, and go do that. And then if you don't know, if they're not on the list, call APAC and somebody. You've got, 8 days or so now. It's on a Tuesday voting. I've been saying November 4th, but that's actually not accurate. So just do the legwork, even if it's a day or two before, and go vote. It's we'll see what the impact is if everybody just takes it one step at a time. And it may just be the impact that one of the people that we went for got higher votes than expected, right? And that's a win too. We don't need this like overnight major win. We just need to see consistent progress, and that will happen if everybody does their part and stay engaged.
Thank you so much for your thoughts on the matter and for giving us the time to have this discussion. It's always a delight to have the chance to talk to you.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
All right, so that brings today's special program to an end. We've talked about the misinformation and fake news campaign that's being carried out by the so-called mainstream media outlets. And we've also talked about what we should do in the face of this and how the diaspora community can use its different platforms to make a change and have a plausible impact. As Kirana Baina leading you through the program, thank you for joining us and goodbye for now.